got enough room. When did you get in?
Oh, I got in. I think we're about to have a hot mic moment, but I got in yesterday.
I have the unfortunate. Okay, welcome everybody to what I think will be our largest panel of the day, and hopefully our most compelling. My name is Josh Rogin. I'm with the Washington Post, and the title of this panel is Keeping Pace in Europe and Asia, Are We Postured to Prevail? We're very lucky. We have an embarrassment of riches today in our panelists, and I'll just quickly introduce them all. First of all, to my immediate right, we have Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, who joined us after a marathon session in the Senate and is working off of 2.5 hours sleep, I'm told, and member of the Armed Services Committee. Thank you so much for joining us. Senator Dan Sullivan also joining us fresh off of the latest Senate action from the great state of Alaska, also on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy of Florida, the co-chair of the Democratic Caucus's National Security Task Force. The newly minted Secretary of the Army, Mark Esper, who has been on the job for exactly 7 days.
Yay.
Welcome, welcome. Welcome to the hot seat, to the conference. The CEO of BAE Systems, Jerry DeMuro, and Undersecretary for Policy in the Obama administration, Michèle Flournoy, the only person to be considered for Deputy Secretary by both the Obama and Trump administrations. Too soon? Okay. I thought that would land. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to make some opening remarks, but let me try to set the frame here. And I don't think I could do it any better than National Security Advisor General McMaster just did. Okay, and he basically gave us the theme for what we're going to talk about today, which is how are we situated, how are we managing our strategy and our policy and our capabilities for the great power challenges ahead. And General McMaster said it very clearly. He said that the great power competition era was coming. He said that the United States was going to pursue a strategy based on the principles of Ronald Reagan's approach to fighting the Soviet Union that were founded in the idea that we are a shining city on the hill, basing our international commitments on values, instruments, threats, and competition. He also said that we have a principled, realist strategy that is based on our interests and respect for sovereignty of other countries. Now that's a pretty complicated mix, to say the least, and how we balance those two ideas, a values-based foreign policy and a interest-based foreign policy, while dealing with the rising China and Russia. That's what we're here to discuss. So if I could just please start with Secretary Esper. 2 minutes, whatever.
Well, thank you. Thank you for setting the context, and thank you for the Reagan Forum for inviting me here today to appear on this panel. It's a privilege to be up here with such a great array of fellow guests as well. Let me just say, with regard to the issue of the panel, are we prevailed to posture in Europe and Asia? Specific to the role that I feel as Secretary of the Army, it is clearly the one area that we are focused on. After 16 years of hard combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, with downward pressure on defense budgets, we have found ourselves in the context of rising threats, certainly in North Korea, and we've seen also a more aggressive Russia in Europe. It is something that we are pivoting for right now, and that is, how do you fight that high-end fight? How do you train, organize, and equip to do that? I've had the privilege on my first trip, since being sworn in, to visit the National Training Center just back east a little bit at Fort Irwin, California. And our soldiers there are doing exactly that. I had the privilege of talking to commanders all the way down from the division to the platoon, and what they told me across the board, after 14 days engaged and finishing up with a live fire, that they're training exactly to the tasks that they will need to accomplish in such a high-end fight in that strategic environment that General McMaster spoke about. And indeed, they are going so far as to train against those tactics that we know that our potential adversaries have in some degrees mastered in whether it be Ukraine or in other parts of the world. So It is something the Army is taking very seriously. It's a challenge in this budget framework that we face, so I'd ask our members of Congress, please pass a budget. Please, no more CRs. But we are doing everything we can with the resources they have, which is why in my first day, I outlined my priorities as being readiness, modernization, and reform, on top of always taking care of our troops and our families. But those priorities are going to be key to what makes sure that our Army is prepared to fight, win, and prevail in Europe and Asia.
Thank you very much. Senator Ernst?
Yes, thank you, Josh, and to the other panelists. It is great to be amongst so many great minds here and share some thoughts with our audience today. When you ask the question, are we postured to prevail, especially if you look at Europe and Asia, primarily Russia and China, I would say that in the short term, certainly we're postured to prevail. We have been stagnant for many, many years. And unfortunately, if you look long term, those near-peer competitors of Russia and China are catching up, and it will not take them long to overcome or overmatch us. So right now, short term, certainly we are up to that challenge, but if you look at the other restraints placed upon us by Congress, by the fact that we can't seem to get our acquisitions in order, long term, we have a lot of changes to make in an ever-changing environment. So I'll leave it there. I know we've got a lot of great questions and comments yet to come, but we have to wrap our arms around this, whether it's the defense industry, whether it is within the administration or Congress. We have to make changes that will set us up for the long term in order to prevail.
Thank you so much. Senator Sullivan?
Thanks, Josh, and I want to thank the Reagan Forum as well, and great to be on this panel. Joni and I worked together quite a lot. We came in together, we're classmates, but just to make this panel a little bit more provocative, I'll start out by saying, in answering the question, I know you like that, Josh, that we're not postured to prevail right now. And to broaden the kind of aperture of the discussion here, I know we're talking a lot about defense and our military, but I would say in order to be postured to prevail, we need to really focus on three areas. One is our military. So we've had, from 2010 to 2016, we cut DoD spending by 25%. 25%. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it with ship collisions. We're seeing it with training accidents. And so what we're trying to do, what we're very focused on, is rebuilding our military and getting our force posture right. If you look at the force posture of U.S. troops in the Asia Pacific, it essentially was a snapshot of where they were at the end of World War II. Okinawa, Guam, Japan. What is the force posture for the next 50 years? And I think we have a lot of work to do on both rebuilding our military, the force posture. The second area we need to focus on to be postured to prevail is with regard to our allies. We are an ally-rich nation. Most of our adversaries and potential adversaries are ally-poor, but we can be doing a lot more work, not only deepening our current alliances, but broadening our alliances. It's an enormous area for opportunity. And then the third area, which I don't think gets talked about nearly enough when we talk about national defense, is what we were working on last night in the Senate, is we have to reignite the huge engine of growth, which has been the U.S. economy. You know, there's a lot of discussion over the last couple of years about what made America great, how to make America great again. What made America great was consistent levels of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% GDP growth. Ronald Reagan had 2 years of 7% GDP growth. The last 13 years, we never hit 3%. And if we continue at an anemic growth of 1.5%, the so-called new normal that they talk about in Washington, you know, CBO is estimating we're going to grow our economy at 1.9% for the next 10 years. 1.9%, America. If that happens, we're not going to be postured to do anything. So what we were focused on last night was growing our economy, getting back to traditional levels of GDP growth, 3, 4%, which I believe we can do. But if we don't do that, all of our national security, all of our military rebuilding is going to be in jeopardy, and that's why I think the tax bill last night was so important.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Great. Well, thank you to the Reagan Defense National Defense Forum for having me here, and thank you, Josh. I'm really honored to be on this panel with such a distinguished group of experts. When I think about whether or not we're postured to prevail, I think about it through the lens of capabilities and community. Let me explain that a little bit. So on the capabilities side, I think that there's a lot to be done to ensure that we have adaptable systems to maintain our technical advantage in a rapidly changing technological environment. And I think it starts with one thing that's been mentioned a couple of times, and that's about having a stable, predictable budget so that we can make investments into emerging technologies and we can provide some predictability to our military budgets. But I also, and that obviously is within the responsibilities of Congress. But I also think over on the Defense Department side, there are some areas that need some modernization in the planning, purchasing, and personnel space to adapt to the shorter cycles of tech life cycles. And in the planning space, when we write war plans, we write them usually about things like tanks and planes and ships. And that doesn't change very quickly, those capabilities, or even the targets that they're intended towards. But when we're talking about the technical space, those technologies change really quickly, and the targets change. If you look back 10 years ago when sequestration and all that began, we weren't really even using the cloud, neither were our adversaries. But now that's a new target. So how do we fix our planning to accommodate for this tighter cycle? And same with purchasing. We have an acquisition, and we've heard a lot about it, loud and clear, a lot of complaining about our acquisitions timeline during this conference. How do we shorten that to ensure that we get the timely access to the latest, most innovative technologies? And then finally on personnel, what kinds of investments do we need to make to ensure that all throughout the department we have personnel who have tech fluency, cyber fluency, whatever it is that you want to call it, but the ability to know what they don't know and to be able to integrate that into all parts of the planning process within the Defense Department. And then going to the second piece on community, I think obviously we need to have a breadth of capabilities to defend against and go on the offense against our adversaries. But community is really important here in the United States. I feel like we're having somewhat of an erosion of what it is to be an American, and an erosion within our society that's weakening us from the inside. And you're seeing that in the hyper-partisan nature that results in sort of the gridlock and the chaos of Washington. You're seeing it reflected in constituents who say to me they don't know what to believe anymore because we're discrediting our media and our intelligence agencies. So where do we get our information that's credible? And the adversaries are taking advantage of that, and they're sowing misinformation and discrediting our institutions. So we need to show leadership, and it's folks who are here at this conference and across this country that need to demonstrate the leadership that America has more that unites us than we do that divides us, and that we can engage with one another in a civil way to try to move this country forward. Otherwise, we're just opening ourselves up to allowing outsiders to undermine our democracy. So that's kind of the two lenses I look at it through.
Excellent, thank you. Secretary Flournoy.
Thank you. I agree with much of what's been said. I'm very pleased to be here as part of this illustrious panel and to be back at the Reagan Forum. I just wanted to add a note of urgency to this question, because I don't believe that if we stand still, we will be postured to prevail in either Europe or Asia in the medium to long term. I think these choices that we make in the next 4 years will determine whether the United States is able to maintain its technological edge and its military edge vis-a-vis a resurgent Russia and a rising China. And so what do we have to do? As has been said by this panel and several others, we have got to get ourselves out of the straitjacket of the Budget Control Act caps and the threat of sequestration. We cannot modernize our military and invest in the cutting-edge capabilities we need, living from continuing resolution to continuing resolution. That's thing one. We obviously need to spend more on defense, to regain readiness, to recapitalize the force. But it's very important that we spend on the right thing. The temptation will be to spend on near-term readiness and getting bigger. But if that's all we do, again, we will risk our technological edge. We have got to understand what the adversaries are doing, where they're seeking to exploit our vulnerabilities, undermine our strengths, and to have very targeted counters to ensure we maintain superiority in space, in cyberspace, in electronic warfare, in undersea warfare, in so many dimensions where we are going to be very challenged if we don't play our cards very well in the next 4 years. In addition, we got to take a fresh look at our posture. Our forces are not in the right places for the future fight, either in Europe or in Asia. And to build a vision, a common vision with our allies of what does a sustainable deterrent posture really look like in each of these regions. And lastly, I would say, is we have to reassure our allies, not just in terms of our capability and our defense activities, but that the United States is a reliable ally. And frankly, right now, when I travel in Asia and Europe, there's a lot of questioning. In Europe, I think, yes, the president ultimately reaffirmed the Article 5 commitment to NATO, but his reluctance to do so was duly noted and has caused a lot of nervousness in Europe. In Asia, they saw the United States over the last several years lead the negotiation of a multilateral high standards trade deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been tremendously advantageous to the United States. They saw us walk away from that, leaving a vacuum which China is now actively trying to fill to rewrite the rules of the rules-based order that we architected 70 years ago and have very much served American interests. So beyond the military capabilities and activities, are these intangible elements of reassurance and predictability. Predictability as a guarantor, as an ally, as a friend, as a power and a leader that other countries can count on.
Excellent, thank you. Mr. DeMuro.
Josh, thank you. And I'd also like to repeat what's been said by my colleagues. I appreciate having the opportunity to participate on the panel, such an august group, and represent industry. Hopefully we don't disappoint on that side. But in answering the question of whether or not, from an industry perspective, we are prepared to prevail, I would pick up on a number of the panels this morning and even General McMaster's comment and say that the international security environment is constantly evolving, as does our national security strategy, and then from that, the national defense strategy. And from an industry perspective, I'll highlight 3 points, and then maybe we'll get into other questions and flesh it out a little bit more, picking up on a few of the themes here. The first one is if we are going to prevail over time. Today is a snapshot in time, but if we're going to prevail over time and recognize that it's a dynamic environment, we have to continue to foster innovation and technology development. We've heard it from the previous administration, we hear it from the Congress, we hear from today's administration, but I would tell you that you need a couple of things consistently to do that from an industry perspective. The first one is a set of business practices and an ecosystem that supports that innovation. And different panels have touched on that today. And I would tell you that I've been doing this a long time and closely involved with senior leadership of the last couple of administrations. And I believe the strategic intent is genuine and in fact is absolutely necessary. All you have to do is look at the defense R&D budgets, and they took a disproportionate share of that 20% cut, as did the acquisition budgets, because personnel accounts weren't addressable. And so, you know, American industry, private sector, public sector, defense sector, it is the arsenal of America, and we need that capital, that innovation, human capital, financial capital to do that. But there's a dichotomy between the strategic intent and the business practices. Some call it acquisition policy, some it's old culture, and I think all 3 legs of the pyramid, or the stool, if you will, need to address this. Congress has a role, for sure, in establishing a culture that has evolved over time. The administration, and certainly DoD as part of the executive branch, as well as we in industry. So, you know, that's the first thing. The second thing is obvious. and that is consistency in budgets. We've had, 24 CRs in the last 10 years. We've heard testimony after testimony about the impact on readiness. We have the incidents, with Fitzgerald and the McCain and many other things. General Gofine spoke this morning about just cessation of flying practice. So all the services are affected by that, but it also has a trickle down to us in industry. If we want to innovate, if we want to invest, what is it that we invest in when we don't know when these programs are going to start? We don't know what those quantities are going to be. Programs start, they slow down, they speed up, the rules of the game change. And so consistency and the elimination, this specter of doubt caused by sequestration would be the second thing. And we applaud, the direction that Congress is taking today. Whatever that number is, up is better than down for sure. And the administration's support for that. So we're encouraged by that. But yet again this year we have a CR. I think it's 10 years in a row DOD's had to operate under that. And then the third one is really we need to create an environment, a system that supports collective security efforts. We're always going to be participating, or primarily with partnerships and allies. And we can talk further about this, but the FMS system as it operates today doesn't support us, I think, as well as it can as a nation in that effort. I don't think it supports our allies as well as they would like. And again, I would say that, in some cases, Congress can be helpful here. The process has become politicized. We all talk to our allies and partners. They don't understand how things like JASTA and congressional holds, can arbitrarily impact these long-term relationships. They're looking for not only companies, but partners in a nation that they can rely on. These systems are going to be in the inventory for decades, and they need to be able to sustain themselves. They need to be able to interoperate and train on a regular basis. So we can talk more extensively, but they're the 3 points that I would raise from industry's perspective.
Excellent. Thank you all. So surprisingly, I think we have much of a broad consensus here, which I'm sure, and if I'm doing my job, will shatter soon enough. But the consensus I'm hearing is that, while we all acknowledge that we have a goal of maintaining our overreach with peer and near-peer competitors, we know that there is a growing consensus that if we don't make some strategic shifts, that we won't be able to maintain that overreach for long. And that's where our national security strategy comes in. So let me start with you, Secretary Esper. Please tell us all of the details of the internal goals.
Well, I can't speak to the national security strategy yet because it has not been released. But clearly, what we will be doing is building a force that is based on a strategy, that's driven by the strategy and not by a budget. But I do want to talk about the one point that came across here, and that is we will not be able to get to that posture where we need to be able to deter, credibly deter in the future, unless we strike the proper balance between readiness today and future readiness tomorrow. And future readiness means making those investments, modernizing the force. Now, key to that, and I said this in my confirmation hearing, is I do not believe we will be able to modernize unless we, at least the Army, fundamentally reforms its acquisition system. A few folks here talked about the length of time, the bureaucracy, et cetera. We will not be able to keep up with our peers and maintain overmatch, given the budgets we have, if we don't fundamentally reform. So the question is, what's the Army doing? You've heard talk over the past few months that we are creating something called a Futures Command. That's true. We'll have a task force come out in a couple months that will lay out how we intend to do that. And the entire purpose of this command is to cut down these cycles. And so you're thinking about a team, what we call cross-functional teams, led by a warfighter that includes all the critical parts of the acquisition system, contracting, testing, the budget folks, et cetera, et cetera. And what they will do is, by having all those folks together in one team working together continuously, we'll break down all those layers that we find in the current system. And with the warfighter in charge, we'll be able to make the trade-offs between requirements, time, schedule, et cetera, that are critical to keeping the system moving quickly. This is one of the things that the Senate, the House, in the National Defense Authorization Act of 16 and 17 asked us to do, putting the chiefs of staff, the Army back in that process in terms of owning those programs. And there are a slew of other things that we'll be talking about with regard to reform, but we're looking at a process here soon in the Army that will reduce requirements determination from 3 to 5 years down to about 12 months. And that'll be a significant step forward in terms of giving industry the clarity they need, the guarantee, because we're going to focus on our key priorities and protect those, and then the speed we need to stay apace of our near peers.
Mr. Secretary, I think we can all agree that acquisitions reform and budget stability are laudable goals, but in reality, a strategy is about choices.
That's right.
About priorities. And in the absence of large budget increases and comprehensive acquisition reform, in the near term, we're going to have to confront some of these choices. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask you this. Do you think our commitments, especially Army commitments in the Middle East, are draining readiness and resources from our ability to prepare for near and peer competitors?
Well, I think all of our commitments around the world have an impact on our ability to sustain near-term readiness. So whether it's what we're doing in the Middle East, which is important, Afghanistan, which is important, the posture we've taken in Europe under the European Deterrence Initiative, in Korea, all these things consume readiness in terms of being prepared to deploy and fight. And one of the challenges we have is that the troops are constantly deployed. So you come back off of maybe a six-month tour in Europe or a 12-month tour in Afghanistan. You don't have much time to repair your vehicles, to refill your ranks, and next thing you know, you're gone again in another 8 months. And so it is a challenge. That's why one thing that the Army has argued for is we do need a higher end strength, because if you can create a higher end strength, you reduce the frequency by which those troops have to go back into the fight or redeploy again. So it's something we have to manage. I think to your broader point, you're right. We're going to have a strategy for the nation, the national security strategy, that the funding likely will not meet, never has. So we have to manage the risk. And I think the services DOD has an obligation to manage that in a dialogue with the Congress about how we intend to fulfill those objectives given that, and being very clear-eyed about what we'll be able to do, where we'll accept risk, and the things we may not be able to do the way we did in the past.
Understood. And where should we take that more risk, in your view?
Well, I think we need to first see what the strategy calls for, because that's going to outline exactly where we're going to need to apply those limited defense dollars. I think one of the things that we should look at is, are there currently training deployments and non-combat deployments where we can maybe reduce our presence, change the force mix, rely on our allies, who, as many folks have said, the National Security Advisor said, we have a plethora of allies, which is something our adversaries don't have. But how can we use them to help offset some of this deployment churn that grinds away at our readiness? So those are just some options right there.
And if the premise of this panel is correct, then we'll need to shift attention away from the Middle East and towards Russia and China. How do you see the Army's role in that? Do you think we think of China as a air and sea, challenge, but I'm told that you have some ideas about how the Army can increase its relevance.
Well, the challenge for the Army right now is we have over 180,000 soldiers deployed in 140 countries. So do the math. When you look at a 470-some thousand force, that's a lot of troops. Army forces are 60-some, 70-some% of the demand from combatant commanders is for Army forces. So we are going to have to make adjustments. Again, I think growing the end strength will be critical. Investments in technology that will allow us to have more capable forces, allow us certainly to face the threats that we see, either Russia in the midterm or China in the far term, will also help us be prepared for those future fights.
Thank you. I'd like to go to Secretary Flournoy. You were integral in the last round of national security and national defense strategy formations. Because for understandable reasons, our current administration official can't talk about the internal deliberations. What do you see? What have you heard? How is it shaping up? Where are the pivot points? And if you were directly involved, what would you recommend?
Wow, small question. No, I mean, I actually think that from what I hear, General McMaster's kind of speech today summarized a lot of the key themes that you're going to see in the National Security Strategy document. And I think that on the face of them, there's a lot of goodness there. I think the challenge is in the trade-offs. The easy part of writing strategy is listing the priorities or talking about the places you want to place emphasis. The hard part of strategy is deciding what you're going to do less of. Where are you going to accept and manage a degree of risk when you don't have enough resources, even if we do have substantial increases in defense spending. And so I think that's really where the rubber meets the road, and that's where we don't yet have a clear indication of what we're going to need. But I do think discussions about some degree of, I mean, yes, we work as a joint force, but I think relative emphasis, I think the Army is going to be central and critical and must be focused on deterrence in Europe, for example, and maybe in more of a supporting role in a theater like Asia. I mean, we've got to have some conversations, or jointness doesn't mean everybody plays equally well in all things. It means that we have some leading elements, some supporting elements, some division of labor, and we have some conversations about what we're not going to be able to do as well, but we're willing to accept that because it's not that important. Again, my worry is, when you're in the Pentagon, especially when you're in a position of responsibility, it's the tyranny of the inbox and the crisis of the day that's got your attention. And so it's a fight to try to stay focused on the very consequential challenge of preparing for that future that seems far away, but is getting a lot closer. And if we ignore it in the next 4 years, or we don't make those investments, we will be in a world of hurt and much more consequential risk in 10 to 15 years, if that.
Thank you. Since you brought it up, let's talk about deterrence in Europe.
Yeah.
It strikes me that the Obama administration made a big decision to pare down our troop presence. 2 brigades left in 2012.
Right.
We're now rebuilding that. And
Yeah.
did we make a mistake? Did we miscalculate?
Well, I've been very clear on this. I'm on the record. I very clearly made a mistake. I think we drew down too far, both in terms of Air Force and Army, and frankly, even the Navy. If you look at the maritime domain, the famous GIUK gap, I mean, we have a shadow of our former presence there, and we're going to need it now that the Russians are building up their maritime capability there. And so I do think the good news is that I think under Secretary Carter and under the last part of the Obama administration, they recognized that. They started the the European Reassurance Initiative. They started putting posture back in. But it's not going back to the old posture that was, getting ready to deal with the hordes coming across the Fulda Gap. It has to be a posture that's more oriented towards the Baltics, towards the defense of Poland and the frontline states, and back towards that critical North Atlantic maritime domain. And that's a different posture. And whether it's, what mix of forward-based, rotationally provided, pre-positioned forces, that can all be determined. But I think this needs to be an area of focus, because if you get that presence right and it's credible to actually deter Vladimir Putin, then that saves you a whole lot of money down the road if you never have to actually fight that fight, because you're really credible and solid in your deterrent. And I should mention that includes strategic nuclear and cyber and lots of other areas, as well as just what's in Europe.
And I would just add, I agree with Michèle, that it's the credible deterrence that we bring to the fight. In Europe, that means a balanced posture between rotational forces that we have back home and a forward presence. And so the virtue of being able now to deploy on a rotating basis, heel to toe, these armor brigade combat teams, combat aviation brigades, really helps enhance that deterrence. It provides assurance to our allies, in that northern flank, so to speak. And it also gives us an opportunity, the Army at least, to train in terms of deploying forces abroad, offloading, doing all that type of staging and stuff you need to do that'll be critical to that next fight. And so
Mr. Secretary, do you have a view over whether or not permanent or rotational is better?
I think the answer is both right now, because based on the size of the force we have and based on what we see out there, right, we have threats in North Korea, long-term threats in China, we have Russia, we're still engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan, Iran. So we can't afford to put all of our chips on one number. So we have maintaining that balanced posture of forward presence like we have in Korea and Europe and elsewhere, and then the rotational force gives us that type of flexibility to do what we need to do.
Well, let me take that question to you, Senator Ernst. Do the Russians seem deterred?
Not at this point, no, absolutely not. And so, absolutely right. Like I said, I feel that right now we're stagnant. Do we still have a little bit of an edge? Maybe. But the Russians tend to play more so in gray zone activities right now. They're neither black nor white. They are just on the threshold of kinetic operations short of war. So they have a little bit of an advantage that we have not fully been taking advantage of. So are we postured to prevail in the long term? No, we're not. And I think they take full advantage of everything that inhibits us from moving ahead, whether it is a constraint through the continuing resolutions or ineffective budgeting process within Congress, whether it is moving away from or not being as friendly with our allies. I think they take advantage of so much of that they do have an edge over us in the long term. So we need to pay attention to that, and we need to be able to move ahead. But certainly the Russians are going to have a competitive edge if we don't close that gap.
Josh, if I might,
Yes.
you know, this gets to the point that I mentioned about a better system that enables collective security. We have, by definition, finite resources, human capital, equipment, et cetera, and we see European nations, some in particular, significantly starting to increase their defense budget. If we can facilitate the transfer of some technology, the transfer of equipment, we strengthen that alliance, we accelerate our ability to deter, we increase interoperability with our forces. We also get the economies of scale back here to our own industry, which benefits, you know, our government and our ability to provide things at a reasonable price. So I think this all fits together.
Well, Jerry,
Can I Josh, real quick, sorry, on
Sure.
on Russia and deterrence. You know, I think you can focus too much on force strength. And what I think happened with regard to Putin in particular, particularly at the end of the last administration, there was a lack of credibility on our part. I think there was a sense from the Russian perspective that they could press in all kinds of areas, Crimea, Ukraine, the Middle East, and we weren't going to do anything. And that was a calculation that Vladimir Putin made with regard to President Obama, and I think it was right. Nobody back then, we could have had a huge army, but if you don't have the credibility to actually use it, then you're going to have countries, particularly like the Russians, who like to press. They press. So one of the things that I asked Secretary Mattis when he came on board was, look, I think we have a lack of credibility right now in the world. Syria didn't help, the red line, but that reverberated all over the world. Trust me, I heard from Asian allies about what happened in Syria, how people were worried about our credibility. Our credibility. That's not talking about divisions, that's talking about straight up U.S. credibility. And I asked Secretary Mattis, both in his confirmation hearing and in other venues, one of the most difficult things you're going to have to do as the new Secretary of Defense, and dangerous, to be perfectly honest, is rebuild American credibility. To have countries look at you and go, whoa, this guy's serious. Maybe I'm not going to move into this country. Maybe the ramifications from the United States are going to be such that I probably shouldn't be playing with fire. And I think what happened at the end of the last administration was we lost credibility. And that takes a lot. It's an intangible. It's not just troops. It's will. And that's what we need a little bit more with regard to deterrence, particularly as it relates to Russia and China. And I think we're getting it back, but it's a dangerous game when you don't have it and you're trying to regain it.
So that
Can
I'd
I
like
just-
to, yeah. So I'm going to
jump
ask
in on this?
Ms. Flournoy and also Congresswoman Murphy to respond to this, because while we can all sort of agree that mistakes were made in the last administration, we're a year in, and if you're going to assert that we've resumed this credibility, I think that's a assertion that deserves a little bit of discussion. Let's say if we look at what's going on in Syria, essentially we've acceded to the Russian leadership there, right? That's what we've seen. If we look what's going on in other parts of the world, it's at least debatable. So I'd like to hear from both, first Undersecretary Flournoy, but also Representative Murphy. If we're talking about deterrence against Russia, and we're talking about hybrid warfare, low-intensity warfare, cyber warfare, information warfare, do we have credibility in those things? Actually, let me start with Secretary Flournoy.
No, I would say I think the greatest damage to our credibility would be done vis-a-vis Russia if we were to have no response to the unprecedented meddling in our democratic processes in the last campaign. Russia mounted an unprecedented, comprehensive, coordinated information operation at scale, and they succeeded in achieving their objectives beyond their wildest dreams with virtually no response. And where we are as a nation is that we are having a hard time acknowledging even what happened, even though the Intelligence Committee has created both classified and unclassified reports that pretty much are pretty clear on what happened. We need a national strategy to harden our electoral systems, to deter Vladimir Putin from doing this again in 2018 and 2020. Right now, we've done virtually nothing. We're not even acknowledging the full extent of what happened at the highest levels. And so, you know, what kind of credibility do we have if we're not even acknowledging and developing a national response plan, public sector, private sector, to harden our democracy against outside meddling and intervention in the future? I was an internal critic on the past administration's policy on Syria and Ukraine. I agree that we should have and could have done more. But I have not seen major changes in this administration, either vis-a-vis Syria or Ukraine. What we heard at lunch today was a restatement of the Obama policy in Ukraine in a new description for this administration. They have not provided lethal aid. They are not doing anything substantially different in Ukraine. So, yes, I think there are issues of credibility that we have to resolve, but I do not see this administration yet taking those steps to fundamentally restore our credibility beyond some efforts to improve our military.
Thank you. Congresswoman?
So I think that the fact that Russia had interfered with our election and continues to probably have ongoing operations, information operations, on our social platforms and in our country is a demonstration that they have not been deterred against using hybrid warfare against us. So that is still an ongoing thing, and I agree with the former Undersecretary that until we as a country can set aside the partisan nature of the conversation and acknowledge that that attack against our democracy happened and that we're going to formulate a response, we will remain vulnerable in that space. I think credibility, too, comes from what we say when we go abroad. And right now, I think there's a little bit of a disconnect between what the mouth is saying and what the body is doing. As
The mouth being the president.
As the commander-in-chief, and as to borrow General Petraeus' words from this morning, there's a lack of message discipline. And I think that that plays into how other countries perceive us, and it is an element of our credibility. But I would also, what I try to say when we're talking to our allies and partners is that maybe this is a moment to not look so much at what we're saying and look at what we're doing. Because I think insofar as Congress is a co-equal branch of government and has the ability to affect this through our oversight and our spending, we have put $5 billion towards the European Deterrence Initiative. There's a hybrid warfare center in Finland where we're cooperating with our allies to address these very specific threats that Russia poses. And, you know, our forces are still there. We're still exercising with allies in the region. So I think despite some of the uncertainty that might come from what is being said, in many ways, we are still moving forward with the policies that we've had in the past of being actively engaged in Europe. And I hope to see that we double down and continue to do things like that, and hope that the mouth catches up with the body.
Excellent. And let me bring this back to our Senate colleagues here. Speaking about credibility, you know, one of the ways that Russia is challenging us is by violating the treaties that were established, some of them in the Reagan administration, but also in other administrations. I can think of 5 off the top of my head, but let me just pick one. The INF, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, okay? If Russia is allowed to violate these treaties without any sort of consequences, what does that say about our credibility? If this administration is trying to save these treaties, what should they do? And if they're not, and do you believe we should save these treaties at all? Perhaps you think that maybe the era where we have limited bilateral arms control treaties with Russia has passed. That's also a view that I've heard. Let me start with you, Senator Ernst, and I'd also like to hear from Senator Sullivan about this.
Certainly, it has been very frustrating, and we just saw where Congress as a body passed additional sanctions on Russia. And as General McMaster stated at lunch, it does take time for those to go into effect. But I think it goes back to our actual policy. What do we do beyond sanctions in order to show Russia or anyone else who would violate an arms treaty that we mean business? And how can we go a step further? So sanctions need to work, we understand that, but what other diplomatic and political pressures can we put on those countries, especially Russia? So we try to do what we can from our angle as Congress, but we also need our allies stepping in. I think it was mentioned earlier that certainly we can run sanctions, but other countries can go above and beyond that as well in working with, whether it's China, whether it's Russia. But we have to have a very strong policy that will deter this, and I don't see that right now. Again, we have to be very firm in our resolve against these countries, or no one, our allies included, will believe what we're saying. So we have to get our act together and push back against Russia. I say it all the time, Russia's not our friend. They're not our friend. So we can do that through the sanctions. Additionally, the NDAA that we just passed, it does include a number of measures regarding Russia. One of the amendments that I had sponsored was the continued prohibition of military exercises with Russia, just things like that, just drawing a line. And as simple as it is, we're just simply saying, we will not cooperate with you until you get your act together as well.
Thank you, thank you. Senator Sullivan?
Well, I think Josh, you're raising a good point, because when you look at the issue of credibility, obviously regaining it takes time. And you're saying, hey, it's coming up in different areas, like the INF issues, like some of our treaty obligations with regard to Russia. I would agree with Michèle that both, again, the last administration and this one haven't done enough with regard to push back against what Russia did during our election. That was kind of both administrations kind of have left that one slide. The body that has tried to is Congress. We stepped in with some fairly significant sanctions against Russia, Iran, and North Korea. The Trump administration was not very supportive of those Russian sanctions, but we had, I think, 90 senators who voted for it. So, and then what Stephanie mentioned, I also agree in terms of the message discipline that also goes to credibility, but foreign policy by tweet is almost by definition not strategic. It's not strategic. So we need to focus on that. But I will give the administration credit on dealing with some of the areas where we're starting to regain credibility. One, where I don't think they've gotten nearly the amount of kind of kudos, I would say, in the press, is with regard to ISIS. We had a 2 or 3 year period where ISIS was growing. I mean, the caliphate occupied a territory larger than the state of Indiana, and the previous administration talked about, we're not going to let this happen, we're not going to let this happen. When the Trump administration came in with Secretary Mattis, when they said, we are going to annihilate them, they started to actually undertake, now it's not 100% strategic, more on the tactical level, but policies that were very, very aggressive. Let me give you one example.
I'm sorry, Senator. We could have a whole discussion about ISIS.
But that is an area where the credibility, in my view, has been regained. What we said we were going to do, we've done. There's still broader challenges now that they essentially don't have any territory anymore. But that is an area where what this administration has said they were going to do, they've done, and I think that that's important to acknowledge that.
I think it does relate to this discussion in the sense that the space that has been vacated by the ISIS caliphate is now being overtaken by the Russians and the Iranians.
And the Iranians, I agree with that.
So it cuts both ways, let's say. But there's a reason that I brought up the INF treaty. It's because the more and more we think about our relationship with Russia, we realize that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And in fact, these arrangements constrain us, not just vis-a-vis Russia, but also vis-a-vis China. And I think there's a growing realization that the long-term challenge in a lot of these things is China.
I couldn't.
So that's where I'm going to take the conversation now. And I want to start with our industry representative, Mr. DeMuro. Do you think we're having the wrong conversation? We're talking about old stuff. We're talking about formations and missiles, when the Chinese are talking about a whole different set of issues, AI, blockchain, whatever it is. They're planning a system of acquisitions, development, procurement that is well beyond what we've been discussing here today in all of these panels. Do you agree with that, and do you think that's a problem that we have the capacity or intent or willingness to address?
We'll start from the back. I think we have the capacity and I think we have the willingness. I probably would not accept your initial characterization that because we are having a discussion about the Russian threat and about formations in Europe and a more, let's say, terrestrial-based, ground-based deterrent, that the national defense and national security strategy is overlooking the difference in the threat from the Far East and Asia. Both the prior administration and the current administration and the leadership that we engage with in industry is looking at the near-term aspects of all 3 or 4 major threats, right, that General McMaster talked about. And yes, it is different in China. And yes, the kinds of things we're working on about intelligence systems, as General Goldfein said this morning, you got to be connected, you got to share, and you got to think. Artificial intelligence, operating in a contested environment in the Asian theater is different. And I can tell you, all of our counterparts in industries are working on Chinese threats, whether it's getting greater range and capacity against their missiles versus what the Russians have. It's about how do we counter the greatest theft in the last 2 decades has been all the intellectual property from the United States, whether it's applied to defense or just commercial technology. They have evolved from a nation that's very good at copying and catching up to one that is now innovating. That's not lost on the people that we're working with, whether it's from the space domain, the cyber domain, land, maritime, undersea. It's not lost. There are approaches being taken on both sides by all the services.
Are the incentives set up in order for industry to?
That gets at the initial question. I think the strategic intent is there. We engage with leadership quite a bit, just our own portfolio. And you can talk to Northrop, you can talk to Lockheed, Raytheon, doesn't matter. We've all increased our investment over the last half decade. And so part of that you can attribute to the fact that we see opportunity in the budget. Capital will move to where it can get a return, and there are some new starts, et cetera. Part of that is at the less than gentle prodding of 2 administrations about that. But it is part of the collaborative effort. All of us are working with DARPA, the research labs for the intel community, as well as the services on some pretty forward-looking things, but also the midterm. Bob Work's given a lot of credit for the 3rd offset. Whatever you think about it, I mean, we're working on some things that triple, quadruple the range of an existing gun on a destroyer so that it can have standoff capability. Taking the kinds of electronic combat solutions that enable an air-breathing fighter aircraft, now putting that on a weapon system as it goes at the pointy end of the spear. So, if it's GPS denied, it can still find its target and it can help learn and teach everybody else about the threat. So I think as an industry, with our partners on the other side, all the services, we're working on near-term, long-term, and we're working on threats that are in gaps in both theaters, but they're different.
Thank you for bringing up the 3rd offset. I haven't heard that term in about, 11 months. Mm-hmm. And it seems that while we don't say it, we're still doing it. Is that right?
Yeah, we are. The challenge, there's no doubt, by any other name, those gaps that were identified, the reasons these rapid capability offices were stood up, the SCO in particular, those things are proceeding. We see You know, under this secretary and Pat Shanahan, no change. Now, they may decide that a particular threat or solution isn't right. The business systems that and the acquisition models that reinforce the investment, I think, are, you know, that's a cultural thing in our practices that will take a long time to turn around, but I see a real willingness to address that issue. Just had a meeting with Undersecretary Lord, you know, half an hour before this.
Well, Mr. Secretary Esper, let me ask you, are we still doing the third offset? Is that still a thing?
Well, what we're doing is, regardless of what you call it, what we're doing is looking at what technologies will enable us to maintain that overmatch in the long term based on what we're seeing the threats do. But I think if you look only at technology, you limit yourself, that you may miss something. So one of the things we're looking at in the Army is not just the technologies that will help us in the future, whether it's AI, unmanned, et cetera, but how do we change our formations? How do we make them more robust? How do we train our soldiers? And we got the best soldiers in the world. So there's a whole slew of things we need to do. How do we manage logistics so you can resupply the force in the fight? I think something that Senator Ernst knows a good deal about. But all those things matter. When we talk about tactics, techniques, and procedures, as I said, I just came from the NTC. The soldiers doing something that I didn't have to do 25 years ago when I was a TOW platoon leader at NTC for the first time, and that is they're now having to learn how to deal with drones that are reconnoitering their positions, and how do they react? What drills do they take? And if you don't have the means right now that we don't to engage them, what other things can you do to avoid that threat? So we're always looking at the technologies that can both maintain that overmatch, keep us a step ahead, but you also have to look more broadly at, again, formations, how you train your soldiers, how you organize, the whole slew of things if you're going to maintain that superiority on the battlefield.
So is that a yes? We're still doing the third offset, or?
Well, if the promise of the third offset is that we're constantly looking at new technologies, the answer is yes. I don't think the name matters. I think the philosophy, the view, the energies that we put behind it is what's
Well, let me ask it a little bit more broadly.
But I would just say the key is we have to think about lethality and how we do that affordably. And that gets into the renovating our business practices. That means, you know, with regard to industry, how do we give them clarity in terms of where we're going and that assurance that we're going to pursue certain technologies. And that's what we're doing in the Army. We've outlined our 6 priority capability areas, and we're going to protect those so we provide that assurance and that focus.
I understand what you're saying about the capability. I want to ask you about the threat. Are we at a broad inflection point? And I'll make this my second to last question. Are we at a broad inflection point where we're realizing that the China challenge is the definitive challenge going forward? And if that's the case, should we use that as our frame for all of these other questions? I'll start with you, Mr. Secretary.
Well, I think we're looking at several threats. I mean, we obviously have right in front of us the North Korea threat, right, that is imminent and that could see us dragged into a war on the peninsula in months. The midterm is Russia, and we view it the long term as China. But we can't just focus on one of those threats. We have to look at all three, make sure we make proper investments going forward, because what we invest in now is what we're going to end up with 10 years from now. The other thing that is often overlooked when you speak about technology is the fact that what countries like China or Russia are developing oftentimes end up in the hands of their proxies, like Iran. So we have to be careful that we know what Russia and China are doing, because if we have to engage in Iran, we may see an Iran who's taken an a la carte approach to procuring technology, so we have to be able to deal with those threats and be able to overmatch and counter them as well.
Thank you. Congresswoman?
Well, one thing, as you may know, China published a roadmap about how they were going to invest in AI. And in that roadmap, they talked about how they were going to become leaders in this space by linking defense with the commercial entities. But given the fact that over year, they have increased the venture capital investments into our Silicon Valley innovative sector into double digits now, it seems to me that they actually meant that they were going to link their defense with our commercial capabilities. So I think one of the things we have to think about is, you know, they're exploiting the open nature of our innovative capitalistic system. And so what do? It's going to be difficult for us to regulate that, but we should think about what now fits into those types of export regulations. But we also need to think about how do we get faster at this game that they're using to reap the benefits of our innovative sector. And so I think, I think it's maybe a better path to focus on how do we get better. at making the most of the commercial sector that we have and beat them at the game that they've already laid out in their strategy.
And do you think we should be doing more to prevent them from infiltrating our open economic system by purchasing up our technology?
I think that's a really difficult question to answer broadly, because the great thing about our system is that it's open, and that creates the competition and the innovation that has led us to be the leader in the world when it comes to this technology. I think regulation in that space could have an unintended consequence of hampering it, and I think we just have to be very careful when we think about it that way.
Thank you. Senator Sullivan.
Yeah, Josh, I think that as you mentioned, as the other panelists mentioned, the most important long-term geostrategic interest by far and challenge that we face is the rise of China. And I don't think we're doing enough right now to set ourselves up to be successful with regard to that. It goes back to the issue, as I mentioned earlier, of yes, a stronger military and force posture that's correct in the region. Allies, I think we need to look at opportunities like maybe even a trilateral security agreement between the United States, Korea, and Japan. And most importantly, the issue I started with is the strength of our economy. And because that can be a magnet for countries that want to be closer to us. And that's an area where we compete with regard to China on a daily basis. And to be honest, in the last decade, we have failed miserably with a lost decade of economic growth. To Stephanie's point, she raises a really good point. How do you balance our innovative society, of which California is probably the leader in the world, and what China is doing? I think what we need to do much more, and I'm from someone who believes in strong open markets, trade agreements, what Ronald Reagan believed in, but what we haven't done, and I think we need to do much, much more with regard to China, is implement a much stronger policy of reciprocity. If we can't go over to China and invest in your AI companies and your biotech companies, and then you can't come over to our country and do it. Now, some people, the free market members of the Republican Party, oh, that's heresy. No, they play by different rules, and I think if we could focus on reciprocity and get our allies to focus on economic reciprocity, that's what we need to be doing. I know that talking to General McMaster and some of the team putting together their national security document, that this idea is starting to percolate. But that is an important area that I think we need to change with regard to the long-term relationship with China, and I think you'd have strong support on the Hill for it.
Excellent. Yes.
And I would go just a step further beyond the technology aspect, or AI as well, with China. They have the long game in mind, and you will see them slipping in to so many different areas. And we saw this in the South China Sea as well, where they started developing those features out there. So we need to be more aggressive and stop doing peace through appeasement and start doing peace through strength. We need freedom of navigation operations going on. We need to be more aggressive in what we're doing as the United States, so that those adversaries or near peer competitors understand that we mean what we say and that we will follow through. So whether it's technology, whether it's development of their own little special islands, whatever it might be, we need to have that strategy in place. I think that's going to be really important. I'm excited to see those final results here soon. Sooner rather than later.
Excellent. Thank you. Before we go to questions, I'm going to ask Secretary Flournoy a totally unrelated question, just because I can.
If it's totally unrelated, I may not have to answer.
Yes. We'll see. So, you know, it's been reported, and my own reporting bears this out, that there's a concern inside the Pentagon, especially inside your old shop, the Office of Secretary of Defense for Policy, that there's been a shift away from civilian influence and towards military influence. More generals, less civilians, a smaller civilian analyst staff, a greater focus on the Joint Chiefs. As someone who's been there and done that, are you concerned about a shift in civilian-military balance in the Pentagon in this administration?
So anytime you have a presidential transition, you have the vacating of several layers of leadership in the agencies, and particularly in the Pentagon, it's 4 or 5 layers. And so there is a period where there's a bit of a vacuum. Unfortunately, that period of vacuum, it's starting to be filled, evidence with some wonderful new arrivals that we have up here on stage, but it's a slow process. So, just for example, the Undersecretary for Policy position, which is basically the Secretary's deputy for all things international, for representation in the national security process, for helping him exercise oversight of military plans and operations. That position, I was confirmed February 5th. It is now December. After 22 candidates, we still don't have a confirmed appointee. That's a problem. And all of the assistant secretaries and the deputies, all of the people under them are not, those shops are not full either. And so where that creates a problem is that nature pours a vacuum. So you have others step in to try to help. Sometimes they're truly helping, sometimes they're taking advantage. But over time, if that imbalance is not corrected, with a fully staffed, fully functional civilian component in the services in OSD, you will have, I don't think we will be living up to the design principles of our democracy, that the military requires civilian oversight, not just in the one person of the secretary, who's the only civilian other than the president in the chain of command, but he needs a staff to help him. There's actually statutory responsibility for that staff. The statute that pertains to my old job specifically said, you shall help the secretary exert civilian oversight of war plans and the conduct of military operations. And that is very, very important that he has a staff to help him do that. And so, I'm concerned because this period has gone on for a long period. I fully believe Secretary Mattis intends to correct that imbalance if he can get his team, if he's allowed by both the White House and the Congress to get his team in place. But it's becoming more concerning because it's been an extended period of time beyond the norm.
Secretary Esper, did you want to comment on the civil-military balance inside the?
I think Michèle has outlined it well. There has been a delay in appointees, case in point. And they hold most of the authority, rightly so, in our system. So it's critical that we fill those positions quickly and get that done, and the sooner the better.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, I have questions here. Please just indicate to me if you'd like to be one of the people to answer them. Question: some characterize China as weaponizing its global economic development activities and foreign investment. How should trade agreements and foreign direct investment, our foreign direct investment, complement our military posture, particularly in Asia and less developed economies? I saw Ms. Flournoy's
I'll
hand
jump
first.
in to give others time. I think we will never match dollar per dollar the investment of an authoritarian state in building infrastructure overseas so that it can extract resources and materials from other countries and so forth. So we have to think asymmetrically. We have to think about targeted investments that really advance our interests, our values, and build allies and relationships. So I'll give you an example. Rather than try to compete to have our own One Belt, One Road initiative, which we'll never have, we need to spend that money rebuilding infrastructure in the United States. I would love to see an American initiative that says, for any country who is open to it, we will help you lay fiber optic cable and the ability for you to get access to Wi-Fi, access to the internet, access to being on the journey to becoming an open society. That will be more powerful in counterbalancing what China is trying to do than anything else, and it would be at a fraction of the cost. That's one example, but we need to think creatively and asymmetrically about how we can use more targeted investment to counter their influence.
I agree with Michèle on those points. I would just mention one asymmetric advantage that we have that I don't think we're using nearly enough. General McMaster at lunch talked about using all instruments of American power. Well, we have a relatively new instrument of American power that Asian countries are thirsting for, including China, and that's energy. We are now the world's energy superpower once again in terms of we're the largest producer of oil, we're the largest producer of natural gas, we're the largest producer of renewables. The Trump administration, in my view, is doing a great job of fully unleashing that, and we should sell that to our allies. We should sell that to China. And I believe that we're just scratching the surface on that issue. Back to the issue of reciprocity that I talked about. You know, I mentioned what I refer to that in kind of two buckets. There's negative reciprocity with regard to China, which I mentioned already. Hey, if we can't do it in your country, you shouldn't be able to do it in our country. Sorry, joke's over. We've been allowing this for too long. But also what I refer to as positive reciprocity. I've spent a lot of time in China encouraging them to come to the United States and do greenfield investments. If you look at what the Japanese did in the 1980s when there was very high tension between the United States and Japan from a trade perspective, they started to come to America and build greenfield investments, auto factories throughout the Midwest and the South. And it started to reduce the tensions because they were using their capital to create economic activity and jobs by the tens of thousands in our country. And I think if China did that, I think they're clearly ready to do that. I think we should accept that. And I think that could have a really good opportunity of lowering the economic tensions in this area that is clearly going to be more tense if we don't kind of take a different look at it.
Senator,
Can I close on that as well?
let me just ask you a very quick follow-up. If we're going to use energy as diplomacy, why sell it to China? Why not just sell it to our allies? Isn't China's expansion based on their accumulation of resources?
Well, look, I'll give you one example, LNG. So Alaska, my state, has been exporting LNG to Japan for over 40 years. That deepens our energy security relationship. That deepens the bonds of friendship between our countries. I think there's an enormous opportunity for more gas exports and oil exports to our allies in the region, but I don't think we should limit it to our allies in the region. I think to have a deeper economic and energy relationship between China and the United States is fine. I mean, they would be more dependent on us. You may have seen when President Trump was in Beijing recently, there was a signing of China looking to help invest in a large-scale Alaska LNG project for their use and the use by other countries. I would be fine with that. That would go to this greenfield investment idea, but it gives us leverage. And I think that's something that's worth taking a strong look at and could ease tensions. So no, I don't think it should be limited just to our allies, but I think we should clearly take advantage of it. We're just scratching the surface of it, but it is a new instrument of American power that we should be wielding.
Both yielding and wielding.
Not yielding, wielding.
Yes,
Senator Ernst.
and Dan put it so well, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but really using those relationships, we can't talk national defense without eventually bleeding over into trade, because we know that trade makes better allies, makes better friends. And Iowa and China have had a very close relationship for a very long time when it comes to agricultural trade. And our ambassador to China right now is the best ambassador out there. He's our former governor of Iowa. And he and President Xi Jinping have had a relationship for decades now. And that has not only proved useful for Iowa in our trade situation, but also with the situation we have with North Korea. Because we developed those bonds years ago through trade, now we have an existing friendship that can be leveraged in working with the North Koreans as well.
Excellent. Well, I think we've come to a closing point. I want to thank our panelists. I think what we can all agree is that when it comes to our great power rivalries, we should hope for the best and prepare for the worst. Can we give our panelists a big round of applause?